A lot of composers, myself included, really like to go out into the woods and forage for mushrooms. But why is this? I'm the classical nerd, and today we're foraging for answers. Look at this guy. The most obvious place to start in any video like this would be to start with John Cage. Cage's work is not traditional music. It runs much closer to musical philosophy than it does to traditional pieces. And to be quite honest with you, most of his work is an attempt to make the audience understand something that's been found, something that would have existed. But instead, Cage forces us to listen to pieces in new contexts. Instead of writing music in terms of notes that have to be interpreted and performed, Cage prefers something that exists naturally. That if you're in a concert hall, there's going to be inevitable program shuffling. There's going to be seats creaking. There's going to be boomers coughing into their elbows much louder than they think that they're being. And all that, to Cage, was music. So Cage was forcing us to listen to music in the way that he did. That is, discovering something that's already there, with no distinction between noise and music. Let's take the famous or infamous 433, a notorious silent piece that even people who aren't into classical music have definitely heard of. This is not a piece in the sense that he's trying to make you listen to silence. He's trying to force you, he's using the concert hall to force you to listen to these random sounds exactly as though they were very intentionally constructed pieces of music. And there's something fascinating about this. Now, Cage also had a great love of mushrooms. After all, he won several $1,000s on an Italian game show one time because he could name just a bunch of species of them. He revived the New York Mycological Society, and he also invented a recipe called dog soup, which is a mushroom-centric replacement for ketchup. And it sounds disgusting, but I do want to try it. Now, some would argue, and I think rightfully so, that because we contain multitudes, there is no reason for us to equate Cage's love of mushrooms on one hand with his experimental philosophy of composition on the other. However, Cage himself said that there's a lot one can learn about music if one devotes oneself to the mushroom. So today I'm here to explore this, the composers who love mushrooms, and I'm here to posit one major thesis, which is that you can learn a lot about a composer's specific style and the way they approach music, their musical philosophy, that is, by if they enjoy foraging for mushrooms. There's something very similar to the process of foraging for a good shroom and discovering that which is already there. Now, if you ask a composer what their process is, you're likely to get more answers than there are composers. Our processes are, let's just say, opaque, even to ourselves. But in recent years, I've tried to get a little more critical distance between myself and my own work. And in doing so, I've discovered that instead of forcing out making sure every note is exactly right, if I move back a little bit and think of notes and melodies and orchestrations as simply something that I'm in the process of discovering, that makes things flow a little bit more naturally, and it makes the music come a little bit more easily. And I do not think that it is a coincidence that the same time I tried to do this consciously is around the same time I really got into hunting for mushrooms. There's certainly other links too. Take composer Eric Chaslow, for whom mushroom hunting is simply the fruitful activity that can result from a nice walk in the woods. It's about putting yourself in a meditative space, putting yourself out in nature, and getting your brain into the mind space for composition. And sure, you could square this with the way I view mushroom hunting and composition and the way Cage viewed mushroom hunting and creative activity, but there are still even more examples. Take the Czech composer Václav Holík. Now, Holík is neither the first nor the last composer to love mushrooms, but he is a little bit more different than some of these other composers that we've talked about today, just because he explicitly writes mushroom music. This dates back to 1980. He was out foraging in the Czech forests with a friend, and he looked at a mushroom, a rare cup fungus, and he heard music in his head. Not just notes, not just a melody, a full piece of music. And he challenged himself to write a piece a day. And he says that when he looks at each individual species of mushroom, they have their own music. He just transcribes the music that he hears when he looks at these mushrooms. Now, I think it's easy to view this with a great deal of skepticism. I mean, after all, you're talking about someone who writes mushroom music. It sounds a little bit farcical on the face of it. But I'd argue that he actually has something called synesthesia. And synesthesia is most commonly, in composers at least, and I think it's more common within composers and musicians in general than it is in the general population. The typical, stereotypical synesthesia is an overlap between sound and color. But the way synesthesia works in the brain is that there's two parts of your brain, two bits that are dedicated to the processing of certain types of information that get cross-wired. So sound and color, that's the most common, but you can have synesthetic qualities too. Some kayakers out there making a lot of noise. You can have a synesthetic overlap in your brain that goes beyond just those typical kinds of associations. In Holík's case, it's a little more intriguing than some other cases, simply because you're not talking about one thing and then another thing. You're not talking about color and sound. You're talking about a whole string of sensory inputs, a melody, and then a whole creature, a fruiting body of a mushroom, which itself is made up of all these tiny, tiny little cells. So I would argue that Holík actually has a synesthetic property about his brain that allows him to look at a mushroom and channel the music that he hears when he looks at the mushroom. But he's not just into mushrooms. That's what he's most famous for, probably because there are so many other composers who have loved mushrooms over the years, myself included. He also hears music when he looks at trees, or when he looks at a rock or a mineral. All of these otherwise inanimate-looking things have a certain magic about them. They have music that he enjoys channeling. There's a lot more here about what's already there, about composition, about creativity in general, as a process of discovery of something that already exists out in the world, that your job is to simply capture that. And I think that's kind of profound. Now, not all of us are going to work that way, or even those of us who like that way of thinking aren't going to think or work that way all the time. But I would argue that if you do creative work, and I hope you do, that you'll think about this, and maybe you'll get into the woods yourself and see if you can find a good mushroom. However, I do have to say, quick note, and this is a disclaimer that I feel like I have to put in here, don't just eat a random mushroom you find in the woods. It's not smart, and if you do find one, you have to be totally 100% sure. There are a lot of resources online. You can talk to someone who knows much more about this than even I do, which, I got into this a year ago, so I'm not in any way an expert. But even if you do find something that you can eat, you gotta cook it first. You don't just pick something out of the woods and chomp on it. It's a recipe for disaster. All right. Plane ruining another take.